I lied, I'm still talking about some Street Fighter bullshit. Mainly because I want to talk about Laura's Vtrigger 2 a little bit. Like, I have, over years, I've never really found good sources to talk about the Vtrigger 2 because no one cared about it. But I finally found some data recently, like a night or two ago, that I figure I'll go ahead and read it off. This, before even getting to that, this is just some infuriating footage. I recently got booted off of here because my connection got so bad that I got disconnected, apparently in a way that upset the game, and I got banned for like a day. And then after just some terrible playthrough, I came back. There was a session where I was playing Oro. Immediately the game is just falling apart. I'm getting screwed over left and right. I get upset, switch to Laura, and it just stops feeding me matches. Jesus Christ, that was motion blur. These people are disappearing. I got upset. I switched to Laura because I just wanted to beat up on some people with a character I knew how to play even in this kind of mess. In the they gave me nothing. I got no matches for like what felt like 10 minutes, and then finally something came through and it was this ridiculousness. Good God, I hate this so much. Anyways, let's start talking about the Vtrigger 2. It's called the Shock Stance. The Shock Stance was originally, when it came out, made up of two parts called the Matsuda Sway and the Shock Choke. What the Matsuda Sway is, well, you know what, I'll just start reading about the data. The Shock Stance itself is a 2-bar V-trigger. Its duration is 2,500 frames. All this information I'm reading, by the way, is once again coming from Super Combo. It's a duration of 2,500 frames, which is 42 seconds. It gives you access to these two moves I just mentioned called the Matsuda Sway and the Shock Choke. The startup for the V-trigger itself is 1 frame. No active frames. The recovery is 5, potentially 9. Oh my God, look at this for a second. So the reason I'm replaying this is because that KO was disjunct. Like, if you know what that animation looks like for her command grab, it did not go straight to the KO like it was supposed to. The game didn't know that the round was over yet. Look at that. I'm gonna tell you right now, in the original fall, that dude was in the original footage on the monitor. Abigail wasn't even on the ground yet. That's how early I have to make decisions and predict things to actually land stuff in this game right now. And this is just playing Abigail footage, because who doesn't like to see an Abigail get vortexed a bit? This is what Abigail plays like. This is what a number of characters who are encouraged to just continue hitting button plays like, and it sometimes just pays off too much on a broken connection. So I got upset. Back to discussing Shock Stance. 5 recovery. That's just for activating the V-trigger itself. Once again, 2,500 frames. Keep that in mind. It's a 2-bar V-trigger. Now, the Matsuda Sway itself is that move where she, during V-trigger, she sways. She turns her back, and what happens is she becomes invincible. The startup for the sway itself, for the motion to become invincible, which is like a command movement, is 4 frames. This can potentially become 20 frames. This can potentially add 13 frames. I'll explain that in a moment. But it has active frames of 30 and a recovery of 12. So she becomes strike and projectile invincible only on frames 3 through 33. This can, remember, what people don't understand about that is that this doesn't just make you do the shock choke. It can also be canceled into normals and unique attacks. Or she can go into the shock or normals, unique attacks, and the V skill. Whether it's V skill 1 or 2. V skill 2, you may remember, Volti Spring, is when she leaps into the air. V skill 1 is her command dash. When this first came out, she only had a command dash, and that was the point. Very often using Shock Stance was to dash forward while using her invincibility. And yes, she does stay invincible. I'll be discussing that more in a moment too. This can be canceled into, like I said, normals, unique attacks, the V skill, or the shock choke. That is the second part, the follow-up move to this that originally came out when she first received this V-Trigger 2. The V skill follow-ups on frames 13 through 33, normals and unique attacks are cancelled, and to retain projectile invincibility until the end of their active frames, specifically the active frames of the unique attacks that you use. Yeah, that, I just wanted to show that on repeat for a second so you can see, especially if I slow it down, how messed up this rollback is at times. This is infuriating. Anyways, startup frame data refers to the startup of the invincibility frames. So that's where Super Combo is talking about how it's 4 frames of startup, and the data in the parentheses, the 13 frames, is referred to when the cancel frame starts. So the sway itself, the motion when she turns her back and becomes invincible, that starts on the 4th frame of activating it. As you can see right there, that's her starting up the sway. What I did was cancel it into a command dash. The 4th frame is, oh my god, this is just terrible. The 4th frame, and here's another thing to keep in mind, totally grab vulnerable. I tried to do a Matsuda sway there to become invincible, but often people just grab, which is honestly safer than just trying to jump backwards or jump or a backdash, because I can use a normal attack or something else to hit you after I use that sway. I can cancel, I can change behaviors. It's not as predictable as people would like to think. It just depends on how you're using it. But yeah, turning your back and becoming invincible, that begins on frame 4. On the 13th frame is when the cancellation starts, is when it's possible to cancel into something else. So the sway itself, keep in mind, uses 200 frames of the V timer. That's about 8% of your 2500 frames. That's for each time that you just make the motion, just the sway, become invincible. Canceling into normals and unique, any of those attacks, you're spending 1,000 frames of your V timer. Remember, you only have 2,500 to deal with. That's 40% for every time that you cancel into an attack. It doesn't actually mention how much you use whenever you use the command dash out of the Matsuda sway. Even when it talks about using the command dash out of the Matsuda sway, it doesn't say that it uses any number of frames of your overall V trigger. Maybe it doesn't use any. I need to check on that. Oh, by the way, that stabbing was the result of a Matsuda sway that didn't get to the invincibility frames quickly enough. Moving onward, discussing the shock choke. That one is referred to from Super Combo as 13 frames of startup plus potentially 7. 2 active frames and a recovery of 51. Very big to whiff this, just like most command grabs. And yet it's still less damning because most of Laura's command grabs, normal or EX, are actually upwards of 60 frames of recovery, and even her command grab critical art is still a frame more than this one. So there's a bit of forgiveness. Except when you use it immediately. That is a change that was made in the last season, is that now her shock choke can be used in Vtrigger 2 without using the Matsuda sway. It used to be that if you were going to use Vtrigger 2, you had to take a chance on just 50-50ing someone on whether or not you were going to command grab them or do something else. Now you can go into the shock choke, her command grab, without actually going into the Matsuda sway. It can be done instantaneously simply by pressing down when you press the heavy punch and kick. But unlike the Matsuda sway command grab, or the Matsuda sway version of the shock choke, apparently this one is 60 frames recovery, just like her other command grabs. It is not 51 frames as the Matsuda sway version is. But it seems to be the same on hit. It's the same positivity. It's 19 frames, 100 damage. So the difference is that on the Matsuda sway, you got 13 plus 7 frames of startup technically, because the 13 frames comes from the time it takes to do the Matsuda sway and cancel it into something. That is where you get 13 frames, as explained earlier. But if you do the shock choke directly on startup, or just referencing the shock choke on its own, it is 7 frames of startup. So with the Matsuda sway, it's 7 frames after 13 frames of startup from the Matsuda sway. On its own, it's just the 7 frames of startup. Here's something I think people will find interesting and also absolutely hate. So something to know about the thunderclap that Laura uses is that it's very vulnerable to airborne attacks. It is very vulnerable. You can, and high attacks. Like the hitbox is apparently, I remember having explained to me at some point a few years ago that the hitbox is very low, and because of that, people will attack through her thunderclap all the time. But as many people have seen from the main way I have used the Matsuda Sway is on jump ins, because this move, specifically the shock choke after the Matsuda Sway makes you invincible to hit attacks. But to keep this in mind, I could have sworn that was a projectile. I should have gone through that with that EX command grab. That whole round was annoying. There was a lot of stuff just not being acknowledged by the game. You can't see it all because rollback isn't always the most visible depending on how it shows up. But anyways, back to what I was saying. The reason why you may have seen me grab that Abigail earlier when he fell into the attack so quickly is because this throw, the shock choke that follows up after the Matsuda Sway, or if you just do it on its own, is invincible to airstrikes and projectiles on frames 1 through 8. That was a nice long string of blocks on his part, by the way. I am getting notably aggressive at this point. I'm kind of tired of chasing people at times through this mess of an internet connection. Like I was saying, that is 8 frames where the shock choke is still invincible. Now, keep in mind, if you do proceed the shock choke with the Matsuda Sway, once again, because the Matsuda Sway is 13 frames, overall, this is 20 frames, but you're invincible on frames 3 through 21. Also important to keep in mind, this grab apparently auto-corrects pretty damn well. It auto-corrects upon its startup, which is, of course, the Matsuda Sway if you do that first. Or like specifically if someone jumps behind the Matsuda Sway, you will still get grabbed. But it also uses the shock choke now. The shock choke specifically uses 40% of your V timer. That is if you use it as a... Honestly, no, that's not if you use it as a follow-up. That's just in general. Now, it doesn't specify on Super Combo if the shock choke itself is 40% or 1,000 frames, and it's on top of the 200 frames that come from using the Matsuda Sway itself. It could be that if you go from the Matsuda Sway directly into the shock choke, they don't count that against you as 1,200 frames, but rather leaves it at 1,000 frames, but will charge you a full 1,000 frames if you use the shock choke on its own. I don't know. I'm just going to assume the worst case scenario, that the Matsuda Sway is being counted, and that if you use the Matsuda Sway directly into the shock choke, you will spend 1,200 frames of V meters. So I tend to believe I'm only going to get about 2 attempts of, especially if it's really committed and I don't use that shock choke unless I'm using the Matsuda Sway first, I'm probably getting 2 good attempts. In my experience, I have been able to get out a couple of good Matsuda Sways without, even if I do get that shock choke twice, I've been able to make it last, make that V meter last sometimes. 2 things about the immediate shock choke that have proven different from the Matsuda Sway version, the original version. One I already mentioned, the recovery is 60 instead of 51 on the immediate shock choke when you just press down on it. The other factor that would be considered a huge trade-off is the fact that unlike the first one, you don't spend 1,000 V meters simply on landing it, or at least it doesn't specify that you spend 1,000 frames of your V meter on landing it. Rather, you spend 1,000 of your V meter, 1,000 frames of your V meter on whiff. If you whiff it, you lose 1,000. But if you land it, you lose the rest of your V timer. That is the trade-off for using the new version of shock choke. And now a quick read-through of how the V skill facet of the V engine relates to the Vtrigger 2 Matsuda Sway, or the shock stance rather. So one thing to keep in mind, a lot of people will know about Laura's V skill 1, her command dash, is that because it has poor recovery and it is not safe, people will typically try to stop it by just throwing out a bunch of jabs in a panic to shut it down. But the thing you should keep in mind about that is that it is still strike invincible on frames 3 through 13 and projectile invincible on frames 3 through 34. It cancels, and also it cancels into shock choke on frames 18 through 19. So it's a lot like Seth's V-Skill 1 or something like that. If you're just throwing out stuff willy-nilly, she's going to avoid it using the invincibility frames, and then she's going to grab you very easily with her command grab, much like when she uses her EX command grab. So yeah, if you also count the initial 13 frames of startup, the overall frames actually lead you out to 31 to 32. Also keep in mind, this will also auto-correct, so if you have a V reversal that makes you roll behind someone or something like that, you will still get command grab. Also, just found the answer to the question I was asking earlier. Apparently, it doesn't use any V meter. The V skill dash itself does not use any of her V timer, but she does pay for this, because that dash, while it uses no V meter, apparently on frames 1 through 17 she is in a counter hit state, so you have to make sure you're not getting hit. Given that you add the initial startup, that means the overall frames are 1 through 30, where it's just not a good place to be. Also, something I'd been thinking about using it, but hadn't got around to trying it. You can totally use her Volti line, her overhead attack directly out of her V-Skill 1 dash after Matsuda Sway. Totally just expands the mix-up. You could have likely been able to do that even before the last season. I just never got around to actually trying it, and I feel ridiculous for not doing so. Of course, the last little bit to say anything about is her V-Skill 2 that nobody cares about, apparently. I still think it's pretty cool. I would attempt to... Normally I would try to use that with Vtrigger 1, even though I'm not very good with Vtrigger 1. It's pretty complex, and I haven't put it into practice for using effective Vtrigger 1, even though people would swear you probably can't really play Laura unless you play Vtrigger 1. Pfft, okay. Matsuda Sway, though, can cancel directly into her V-Skill 2 leap. It's the V-Skill 2 leap itself is 11 frames on top of the 13 frames for the Matsuda Sway, 2 frames active. Recovery all put together is 25 frames plus 14. This version of V-Skill 2, when you're using it with Vtrigger 2 and the follow-ups, you know, the kick that she does or releasing the thunderclap, they behave exactly like normally outside of Vtrigger 2, except that the initial leap is now projectile invincible. So the way that her V-Skill 2 would normally work, now it has projectile invincibility added to it on frames 1 through 15. That's the benefit of using that under Vtrigger 2. The overall frames will bring this invincibility to frames 3 through 29. So that's what I have to say about Laura's Vtrigger 2. It's been a number of years coming, just like trial and error stuff, never seeing any videos or anything online, and I just sat down recently and really looked for someone to tell me something straightforward. Mainly trying to figure out what I could on my own through looking at data in the FAT app and so forth, but then that just turned into me actually finding information. Like I just got redirected from the FAT app to supercombo.gg, and it gave the full explanation of this stuff. Years, and I just now got around to hearing about it. Swag.